everything going on. And it's interesting that Zelensky and the Atlantic Council, which is basically a mouthpiece for the military-industrial complex, have talked about turning Ukraine into a big Israel. That's their plan, is turning it into an apartheid state that's constantly at war and a constant source of revenue for the military-industrial complex. So, thanks to Slava for that amazing history lesson. We know that the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois press, in order to lie about these things, they have to isolate events from the historical factors that created them. Right, so I've never seen anyone go that far back in the history, but that helps debunk the lies. Like they have to say this conflict started in 2022 in order to lie about it. Because if you go back even in 2014, you start to see the influence of Nazism and banderism and U.S.-backed vandalism. Although I had a debate with a popular political streamer Bausch recently. He informed me that there are actually no Nazis in Ukraine. So you've all been deceived by Putin propaganda, and I'm sorry to tell you. I've actually met a handful of Ukrainian refugees recently through wrestling. They keep coming over. The first one I met has been here for a while. I didn't know how to start a conversation with him, so I just asked, are you from Western or Eastern Ukraine? He goes, Western Ukraine, where the Patriots are. I'm like, okay. I'm not going to take that conversation any further. But then actually I met another kid who wrestled on the Wisconsin national team with us from Ukraine. He was from Zaporozhye. And he had a totally different perspective. He spoke very highly of the Soviet Union. I went on a walk with him before the tournament because he liked to do that, and he was explaining like the Americans don't like to walk, and your guys' infrastructure isn't set up for walking. It's built for cars, and he's like the Soviet Union built all this public transportation, all these walking paths. It was really interesting to hear. And then recently I met one more refugee who had to pay the Armenian mob. He said I didn't get the full story, but he had to pay him $7,000 3 separate times to sneak him out of Ukraine, and now he's coaching wrestling in Minneapolis. So pretty wild how it's coming home. Also, I went home to see my parents the other day. They live in Baraboo, Wisconsin, and there is a Ukrainian camp funded by a Ukrainian millionaire in Chicago with a statue of Stefan Bandera. And it's like one of these youth camps where they're indoctrinating kids with banderism. And actually, there was a controversy in Baraboo a while ago where kids took a homecoming picture doing the Sieg Heil, like the Hail Hitler, and you gotta wonder if there's some kind of connection there. I wanted to say Alexander McKay's speech was amazing. I learned a whole bunch about Europe from that, which I appreciate. It was a dream come true to hear from Jeff Munson. This is the first time I've been at a political event where there's someone else with cauliflower ear. That's really encouraging. It's hard to convince combat sports athletes to be Russophobic because you grow up your whole life watching these amazing Russian combat sports athletes. And it's like you can't convince me that the country that produced Buvaisar Satiev, Fedor Emelianenko, and Alexander Karelin are inferior to Americans. I've watched them beat up Americans my entire life. It doesn't make any sense.
But what about
I also like hearing Jeff. It's always interesting hearing people in Russia talk about the pro-Soviet sentiment there. People do miss the economic benefits, the free daycare, the free health care, the education, but what they all talk about is that sort of socialistic culture and how it's a different way of being where you help each other and you care about each other. And in our rugged individualist society, that just sounds so incredible, I just want to talk a little bit today about multipolarity and what that means for socialism and the possibility of socialism around the world. Obviously, we've seen a string of anti-colonial coups now in Africa, which people mentioned in Mali, Burkina Faso, and elsewhere. And some of those coups, the people were waving around Russian and Chinese flags, which was really interesting. And I think we can learn a lot looking at the Cuban Revolution in the way that Fidel Castro was originally a Cuban nationalist. And eventually, he had to declare the revolution to be socialist in character, because he realized there's no real independence without socialism, which is obviously something Che Guevara and Raul Castro were saying from the beginning. But how do you have independence when your mines, your factories, and your farmland are owned by Western multinationals? You can't. There can only be true independence through socialism. And I think that's what a lot of these countries are going to realize as they try and kick out the Western imperialists and as things develop. I mean, that's what Libya realized under Gaddafi, and that's the kind of system they were moving towards, giving people education, owning their own farmland, giving it to the people, giving the people tools to start farms. And we know that NATO partially killed Gaddafi because he was moving towards currency independence. So it's, I mean, neocolonialism is really the continued economic domination of these countries, and you can't free yourself from neocolonialism without economic independence in the era of capitalist imperialism. The US-dominated global financial system, or the Bretton Woods system, that centers around the IMF and the World Bank that were created in 1944. Obviously in 1914 or when was imperialism published? 1917 or 1914?
1916.
16?
Yeah.
Okay. Lenin describes capitalist imperialism, that capitalism has reached this new stage dominated by finance capital, where capitalists will go abroad and try and super exploit countries. And the Bretton Woods system, the IMF and World Bank, are really an outgrowth of that. They're tools that the finance capitalists use to assert their dominance and control other countries. So without freedom from that Bretton Woods system, from that US-dominated global financial system, there's no real independence and there's no real sovereignty. And then IMF and World Bank are obviously, they have thousands of subsidiary banks which are everywhere, and the power of those financial institutions, though, are ultimately backed up by the barrel of a gun. You know, that's why the U.S. maintains nearly 1,000 military bases and all these military agreements, and you can see that with the way that they enforce the blockade on Cuba and the sanctions on Venezuela. Like, yes, they're financial sanctions that a lot of countries have to follow, and the European countries just follow them because they side with the U.S. like puppets. But like when Iran tried to send oil to Venezuela against the wishes of the U.S., the oil was intercepted by the U.S. Navy, and they basically pirated it. They took it back to Houston. So, perfect example here of how the U.S. is using economic warfare and financial warfare, but ultimately it's backed up by military force. Another good example of the way that economic independence is needed for true independence is Iran. A country that's not a socialist country, but who had an Islamic revolution in 1979 that was highly driven by resentment against the West and the Western-backed Shah. And we've seen that they still don't call themselves socialists, but all of their banks are in state hands, right? 70% of their industry is in the hands of the state. They're using central economic planning and forging closer ties with Russia, China. They've had to move towards a socialistic style of economics in order to maintain independence and maintain their sovereignty. And I imagine similar things will be happening in Africa soon. We'll see how they develop and the way that the West reacts to what's been going on. But and I'd also like to touch on BRICS and the role that BRICS is playing in developing the productive forces of countries where imperialism has arrested them. And prevented them from developing, because it's the orthodox Marxist view that it's the advancement of the productive forces that ultimately causes the relations of production to burst asunder, and we can move to a new era, a new social system. So Marx says in the manifesto, talking about how feudalism transformed into capitalism in Europe, he said, in one word, the feudal relations of property became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to burst asunder, and they were burst asunder. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted in it, and the economic and political sway of the bourgeois class. So it was originally the view that nations had to go through a period of capitalist development where the productive forces are advanced in order to create the conditions for socialism to come about. But what Lenin notices in his book Imperialism is that in countries targeted by imperialism, the productive forces are prevented from developing, and they're held in this sort of semi-feudal state, and that's where you get the worker-peasant alliance from, him saying we need to work together with the peasants, and then immediately develop our productive forces after the revolution. And Maoists and other leftist ultras have criticized China to their adherence of a foreign policy of complete non-interventionism and complete completely not messing with the politics of other countries, because these ultras would like China to export revolution, and try and do the same thing that the USSR did. But that's not how China sees their role in 2023. They are not here to export revolution and create unnecessary problems with the US. But what they are doing is helping countries, especially countries targeted by imperialism, develop their productive forces. And in doing so, they're bringing millions of people out of poverty, and they're creating the preconditions for socialism. So we'll help you develop, and then if you want to have a socialist revolution, go for it. But we're not going to export revolution. We're not going to mess with your politics. And it's really hopeful to see that, and really great to see what China's doing. And the people who sit in the West, in the belly of the beast, in the heart of the empire, and just carry water for imperialist narratives about China, it's completely ridiculous. And Russia, of course. But to quote even Noam Chomsky about China, he said, it's driving the U.S. crazy because they can't do anything about it. China's just investing and building, investing and building, and they're playing the long game. So lastly, I just want to talk about what Americans can do to help usher in this era of multipolarity and eventually global socialism. One, stop buying into corporate media propaganda about Russia and China. And if you do, just stop calling yourself a socialist, please. You're making it more difficult for the rest of us who know what's going on in the world. If you're a socialist in 2023 living in the US, no reason to carry water for imperialist talking points, like I said. Another thing that I think is important to recognize, as much as I like BRICS and what China's doing, it's not a cure-all. Vijay Prashad has said we shouldn't be overly optimistic about what China's doing, because the world is still dominated by the IMF, the World Bank, and the Bretton Woods system. And it's going to take a long time before an alternative system can overtake that. We're still a long way off from China, Russia, and BRICS overtaking the IMF and World Bank as the most powerful financial institutions in the world. So meaning revolution is still important. Point number 3, China doesn't export revolution, but revolution is still important, and it still moves us closer to multipolarity. There's a reason that the capitalist imperialists have invested so much money in destroying Cuba and the Bolivarian Republic in Venezuela. Because these are countries who threw off the shackles of Western economic dominance, who are right in the backyard of the United States. There's a reason that France and the corporate media had a meltdown over the anti-colonial coups in Africa that booted out Western military presence. It's because these events weaken the empire and they move us closer to a multipolar world, right? So it's not just China's investment in BRICS and what China's doing. There's still a place for revolution. And there's still a place for socialists to rise up, and that's what China sees their role as. We'll help you develop your productive forces, but figure out your own politics. Yeah. Which leads me to my final point. The number one thing that Americans can do to usher in the era of multipolarity is to have a revolution here at home. And an American revolution might seem far-fetched at this point, but it's on American socialists. The onus is on us to educate the working class and make it happen. It's got to start somewhere. It's not like there hasn't been a revolution before in this country. There was the revolution against the British that established independence. There was the Civil War that moved the South away from this bourgeois slavery mode of production and towards capitalism. We have a revolutionary history. If you think revolution's impossible, I'd like to point out that in 2022, the US government forced TikTok, to the social media app, to hand over management of their American servers to a company called Oracle, based in Texas, with very deep ties to the State Department and the CIA. So Oracle proceeded to hire a bunch of NATO operatives, a bunch of national security agents, and 320,000 accounts were banned, including ours, that had amassed nearly 400,000 followers. An explicitly Marxist-Leninist account in the Midwest, which a lot of people think is completely anti-communist, although I'd argue it's not, just wiped that out. So I would say, if the ruling class thought revolution was far-fetched and impossible, why would they spend so much time, money, and effort trying to suppress us and trying to suppress education? If they think it's possible, then we should think it's possible as well.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah.
So the American ruling class knows that there's a crisis of legitimacy in this country, where only 17% of people support Congress, while 80% of them are living paycheck to paycheck. Most people are drowning in debt placed upon them by the richest people in society. 60% of Americans experience medical debt at some point, which is crazy that our healthcare system is better at trapping you in debt than it is at making you well. Yeah. So the idea that we can't organize people against this system is fucking crazy. I'm sorry, like it just is. Most people know that the government's screwing them. They might be a little bit scared of the words communism and socialism, but that's the role of having conversations, and that's the role of education. That's our job as Americans. And you know, it's also realizing that not everyone's going to agree with you on everything. Not everyone's going to have the exact same views on pronouns or who should be able to compete in what sports divisions. But most people can agree that poor people are getting screwed by this economic system. And the only people that this economic system is working for is the richest in society, who have made their money by exploiting the rest of us. So if we focus on that and organize people based on class, we can absolutely organize a revolution in this country, or a revolutionary movement. And then we'll bring an end to the unipolar US-dominated world forever. I mean, there's a story Carlos tells. I can't remember. Carlos runs Midwestern Marx with me. I can't remember who it was, but there was some American socialist who went to some socialist country. It was Cuba or whatever, and he asked the revolutionaries, "What can I do? What can I do to help?" They say, "Go home and have a revolution in America. Go overthrow your imperialist government that's robbing us." You know, that we're in the most anti-communist country in the world, but we also have the greatest imperative to overthrow our anti-communist ruling class. But it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of strategy, a lot of solidarity, and a lot of cooperation to do it, which part of the reason we founded Midwestern Marx is because we see those aspects missing from the current American left, which is very individualistic, hyper-focused on social issues, and does what Michael Parenti called ABC theorizing, anything but class. We'll talk about anything but the class struggle. Yeah, I just want to add also, I couldn't agree more with the idea that Donald expressed about communists being upstanding members of their community and engaging in sort of personal development. And one of the ideas my buddy Carlos has expressed is that we need to develop some sort of socialist virtue ethic, some sort of idea that, you know, personal development is good, being an upstanding member of your community is good, you know, and by doing that and treating people with respect is how you're going to gain their trust and how you're going to get them to listen to you when you talk about things. You don't need to beat them over the head with communism, but earn people's respect, treat them well, be a competent person, and they'll listen to you. I have a good buddy who became a much better communist after he read Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. He didn't like Jordan's politics, but he started cleaning his room, making his bed. He was a better organizer after that. It just is what it is, right? So, yeah, that's all I have to say. There's still a place for revolution in 21st century socialism, and the onus is on us to create a revolution here in the U.S. So, yeah, sorry I was short. I'm used to TikTok videos.